Thank you, everyone, for being with us this afternoon. My name is Rim Turkmani. I am the principal investigator of the Legitimacy and Citizenship in the Arab World Research Program, which is based at LSE and funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. It gives me great pleasure today to welcome our speaker, Zaid Al-Ali, who is joining us today from Carthage, from Tunisia. There's a lot I can say introducing Zaid, but I would like to start with his book. He's the author of The Struggle for Future of Iraq. If you haven't done so already, I highly recommend you to buy and read this book. It's a little bit painful to read in the beginning, to see your journey, Zaid, how you experience how corruption, incompetence, and sectarianism have undermined democracy in Iraq. And I think many also of us in the Arab world, not just Iraq, can identify with what you went through. It's a great book and great to see your own experience going with the constitutional process in Iraq and how it was undermined and the results. And it's great that we'll be able to learn from this experience today and draw parallels with Syria. Zaid Al-Ali is a now senior advisor on constitutional building for the International IDEA organization. He has practiced international commercial arbitration for more than 20 years, and he also worked at the United Nations in Iraq. He has worked on constitutional building process and peace building, not only in Iraq, but also in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Sudan, and Yemen. He also have taught in Princeton University, at Central European University as well. He's now writing, or actually just finished, right? Writing his new book, Arab Constitutionalism, The Coming Revolution, which will be out by Cambridge Press in 2021. Looking forward to reading the book, Zaid, and congratulations on finishing what I'm sure will be a great manuscript. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much. So first of all, thanks everyone for being here. Thanks team for the invitation, and thanks for the organizers for hosting this. So I'm doing this at home, so that comes with its usual risks. My children may burst in at any moment, but we'll have to take that as it comes. And I've been told to speak for around about 30 to 40 minutes. I'll try to be brief. I have a stopwatch in front of me, and Reem has been instructed to cut me off if I get too excited about Iraq and start speaking for too long. So what I'll start by doing is speaking about the title of the talk and trying to unpack it, and then just talking through how these things have been managed in history in Syria and in Iraq. Obviously, I know a lot more about Iraq than I do about Syria, but I'll try to draw parallels to the extent that I can. And it'd be great to hear what people think about these things in the conversation. So first of all, the title of the talk is The Role of Legitimate Constitution Building in Promoting Stability in Syria and in Iraq. So there are different terms there that need to be unpacked. So the first is constitution building. What is that? What is constitution building? So traditionally people have viewed constitution building as like a technical exercise, as if systems of government and the relationship between the individual and the state were not really political questions, that as if they were questions that were to be determined merely on a technical basis. And what that would mean is that you could bring in experts, and the experts will look at a draft constitution or draw up a draft constitution and just debate it between themselves and sort of get it out of the way in a non-political way. So with time, I think that concept or that notion has basically disappeared, I hope at least. And the reason why that is because now people view constitutions in the way that they should be, which is, and the way which a lot of people used to, but not to a sufficient extent perhaps in some circles, is that constitutions are really political pacts, and sometimes they're even more than that. Sometimes they're peace pacts, right? Sometimes they're necessary documents that need to be negotiated and entered into in order to end a conflict. Sometimes they're needed in order to prevent a conflict, and sometimes they come in, after a conflict has ended, but in order to cement a new democratic future for a country, as was done in Spain, for example, in the 1970s. So that's the first thing, is that constitution building should be reviewed through a purely political lens, and also in the context of what's going on in Syria, Iraq, Sudan, Yemen, many other countries, Libya as well. Constitutions should also be viewed through the lens of peace, war, stability as well. The other question, or the other term that comes up in the title, which is really important, is legitimacy, right? So what does that mean? So it can mean different things for different people. It at least means one of the three things, and possibly all of the following three. So first of all, popular legitimacy. So what that suggests is that in order for a constitution to be legitimate, it would have to be supported by sufficient numbers of people in the country. It can never enjoy the support of everyone in the country. That's not achievable anywhere, I think, not even in the most stable places. But sufficient degree of acceptance would be necessary. And in countries that are very, very plural by their mere definition, I think all countries are plural, but in some countries the plurality is more accentuated in particular points in history. So, for example, in Iraq, the communalism and the plurality is very accentuated currently. Popular legitimacy will also mean obtaining sufficient support within each of the principal communities as well. It wouldn't be sufficient to say, well, we have 80% support for the Constitution if the 20% that doesn't support it are all members of the exact same community and over 90% of that community don't support that Constitution. That wouldn't be sufficient, at least in my conception, for achieving sufficient legitimacy, popular legitimacy in that type of context. The other type of legitimacy would be normative, right? So what does that mean? That means that in situations where, for example, popular legitimacy is not achieved, where a constitution doesn't enjoy the support of sufficient numbers of people, it can still enjoy normative legitimacy if it brings sufficient stability and creates a situation where the delivery of services and goods to ordinary people is heightened, increased, improved in that particular country. So, for example, just to give you a really, really obvious example, is Japan after the end of the Second World War. The constitution was not drafted by Japanese; it was drafted by Americans behind a closed door. Over time, so obviously didn't enjoy any popular legitimacy, but it's broadly considered to enjoy normative legitimacy because Japan, it's one of the elements that's allowed for Japan to develop in the way that it has. It's certainly not the only element, maybe not even the principal element, but it's one of the elements that's contributed to it. And the other form of legitimacy that a constitution can enjoy is international. And there I would direct everyone to look at constitutions like Morocco, where they very, very much look at international legitimacy as being a source of legitimacy for their countries. And the way in which that's done is by consistently referring to international norms, international agreements in their constitutional documents as a way to make sure that internationally around the world, people view those texts as being in conformity with what's regarded as being either best practice, acceptable norms in their own countries. And that would hopefully contribute to stability in the country as well. So those are the different forms of legitimacy. And then the question becomes, well, what does stability mean, right? I mean, so that's a difficult one because I think it could mean different things for different people and probably would mean different things for the people in the country itself. So stability for someone like me, I live in a fairly comfortable environment. What I would understand by that, for me at least, is that should require, first of all, no violence, political violence in the country. Also, for me, that would include also democratic stability as well. That it wouldn't be sufficient for me to live in a stable dictatorship for me to consider that was stable. That wouldn't be stable in my view, because I would always look ahead and see that a dictatorship would always lead to violence and unpredictability in the mid to long term. But other people may disagree with that. Other people in Iraq, certainly today, after everything that's happened, would far prefer to go back to a period of stability. Sadly, I say this with regret, even though it wasn't democratic. So those are important things to keep into consideration. Now, so having defined those terms, the question then becomes: how does constitution building contribute to legitimacy and stability? How can it do so? And the answer to that is that it doesn't always do so, and sometimes it achieves the opposite, right? Sometimes it contributes to illegitimacy, it contributes to instability. As we can see, for example, in countries like, just to cite a couple of examples, in Yemen, the constitution there certainly didn't contribute to stability. Some people have argued that the constitution that was drafted during 2014 in Yemen, I've made the argument that that's the case also in Iraq in 2003. And I'll get to that in a moment. And before I do that, I'll also go back to the early history of constitutional history in Iraq as well. Then the other way in which constitutions or constitution building can contribute to legitimacy is by the outcome. And this goes to the issue of is normative legitimacy. So first thing is that a constitution, in order to bring legitimacy, would first have to try, in this day and age, in the type of situation that we're talking about today, would have to try to contribute to it through inclusivity. That's something that's broadly accepted today. People understand that in different ways, of course, but people broadly understand that in order for a constitution to bring about legitimacy and stability in a country, the process through which that constitution is drafted, is negotiated, is entered into, would have to be sufficiently inclusive, right? And so therefore that goes into the notion of popular legitimacy. Then the other way is by delivering a satisfying outcome in terms of the text of the constitution itself. It's not sufficient, at least in my conception, to be inclusive if the outcome is substantively deficient, right? And Iraq provides a very good example of that, and other constitutions do that too as well. And I'll get into those in a minute. So if we take all of those elements together and we apply them to Iraqi constitutional history and Syria constitutional history, what do we get? We get, if we go back to the very beginning of the Iraqi state, back in the 1910s and 1920s, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, around about the same time that Syria was emerging as well. What are the elements, the factual things that took place? I won't bore you with all of the details, but I'll try to point out a few elements which are relevant for the discussion. So the first is that the Iraqi constitutional process that took place in the 1920s was dominated by the United Kingdom. So, they tried, of course, as they always do, to try to make it look like it's a grassroots thing, and the constitutions are being drafted by locals and has the approval of locals and is being, passed for the benefit of locals. But of course, in that type of situation where the United Kingdom being the dominant force that it was in Iraq at the time, where Iraqi civil society was really quite weak at the time as well, despite some emerging forces that were increasingly powerful at the time in the decades that followed, the United Kingdom was really allowed at that time to play a very dominant role in the constitutional process. How did that materialize? First of all, by choosing a head of state, the monarch who was chosen at the time. A plebiscite, of course, was organized in order to make it look like the monarch was chosen by the people. There was only one option on the plebiscite, so the outcome was predetermined, of course. The other element was that the constitution was drafted by, theoretically, or approved at least, by a constituent assembly, which was made up by Iraqis, but was indirectly chosen by councils, local councils that were put together by the British. So, of course, that made it very easy for them to weed out individuals that they didn't consider to be appropriate, troublemakers or people who were more likely to reject the type of constitution that they were looking to impose on the country. And the other way in which the British played a very important role, of course, was also to make sure that the constitution was being drafted in conjunction with senior British officials as well, who were present in all sorts of other parts of the British domains and who brought that experience of drafting constitutions for countries that were still, trying to deal with British control and to bring those concepts to Iraq. And then if we look at Syria, the way in which the constitution of Syria was drafted, so at first it was very, very different. So I'm sure many people in who are listening today know a lot more about this than I do. But at first the Syrian constitutional process was really defined by the fact that they were trying to adopt their constitution in a way that would establish Syria's capability, its capacity to rule itself independently without foreign control. So early on, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and up until around about 1920, for a few years, most of Syria was free from occupation, or at least large parts of Syria were free from occupation, from British or French occupation. And elections were organized in many of those areas. In those areas that were under occupation, where elections couldn't be organized, they were, sort of like local councils that were done sort of like underground in a way to sort of choose representatives. And the electorate, the people who were elected, were then required to oversee the adoption of a constitution at the time. That lasted for a little while. They got as far as until 1920, until Syria was invaded by the French, who brought an end to that experiment. If I remember correctly, the Syrian Constitutional Assembly, the Constituent Assembly, was able to get through, they drafted the whole text and adopted 2 of the provisions formally before at the time when the French invaded. And at that point, the whole process was forced to come to an end. The whole text was in existence, so they drafted the text, but had only managed to adopt them formally in the full assembly. Had only managed to adopt two provisions before when France invaded. And then from the period of 1920 to 1930, there were conversations about the Constitution that lasted for a while. Much of the original text was try to survive. Its proponents tried to keep the original text and try to force France to adopt it. Ultimately, much of the text was maintained, but France inserted a few provisions that provided very specifically that any provisions that contradicted France's interests would not be implemented. There was a specific provision that was adopted eventually in 1930 where that was put, I'm paraphrasing it, but that's more or less what it said. Now, if you look at the outcome of those different processes, so obviously the process through which Iraq's 1925 constitution and Syria's 1930 constitution was clearly insufficiently inclusive. The reason why is because anyone at the time who was opposed to the presence of the British or the French, who thought that it was abhorrent, the idea of drafting a constitution under their control was abhorrent, would either not participate or was going to be excluded. So immediately from the start, a whole segment of the population is excluded for political reasons. That's very, very clear. Either excluded themselves or were all excluded by the controlling authorities. Then the outcome is really interesting there. So nominally, what the British established was a constitutional monarchy. And so that's the term that's used typically to describe what was established in Iraq at the time. So I don't really like that term. And the reason why I don't like it is because that's the same sort of term that's used to describe countries like Belgium, for example, right, where they have a constitutional monarchy. But what we had in Iraq at the time, and what still exists in many other countries as well today, is a monarchy with an elected parliament, which had some nominal powers, but where the monarch had hyper-presidential powers. And what I mean is that the monarch had full control over government policy, had full control over the composition of government, had full control over when the government should be dismissed, could dissolve parliament at will, which made it extremely difficult for Parliament to use its oversight powers to control government policy or government action, and also had full control over the composition of the upper chamber as well, and also was nominally the head of the judiciary, right? So, I mean, those sorts of powers are totally out of control and shouldn't be used to describe a system of government where use the same sort of term to describe countries like Belgium. So I wouldn't use the term at all. I wouldn't use the term constitutional monarchy at all. My strong preference would be to use the term hyper-presidential or where the executive enjoys hyper functions, right? That's simply not the sort of thing that would be acceptable in a democracy today. So that's what eventually was adopted in Iraq. So in Syria at the time, when the beginning of their process before the French invasion, much of that sort of framework was being adopted as well. There was a lot of similarity between what I described and what the Syrians were discussing at the time and eventually were unable to adopt. But one of the major differences between Syria and Iraq at the time, the Syrian draft 1920 constitution and Iraq's 1925 constitution, is that the Syrian draft constitution also included two main elements. First of all, very, very strong decentralization, which was at the time for countries like Iraq, Egypt, many other countries in the region, was very, very unusual. And the reasons why Syria was doing that was because in recognition of the fact that the country was very plural, first of all, that there were different geographic areas that had their own identities, that had their own objectives in terms of what it was that they thought should be acceptable governance for themselves. It's very interesting that the Syrians were doing that at a period of time where they were free from foreign occupation. And then eventually, when the country was taken over, those provisions were all diluted. First of all, in terms of what was there on paper and definitely in practice as well. And the other element that was also very interesting as well is that the Syrians were very, very seriously debating the issue of gender equality as well. So ultimately, those discussions didn't reach the height of some people's ambitions. But the fact that those discussions were happening the way that they did at that period of time, when Syria was free, was also very, very interesting and stands in stark contrast to other countries in the region such as, for example, Iraq, Jordan, Egypt, and other countries as well. So that's all very, very interesting in the way in which you can really mark out Syria and its early experiences, its early attempt to adopt a constitution from what eventually happened, first of all, in Syria itself, and also Iraq and in other countries as well. And so the consequences of that over the following decades was basically the fact that the constitutions were adopted in a way that's very not inclusive, excluding large segments of the population, either by the fact that they excluded themselves or were excluded by the controlling authorities, and also that the outcome of the process as well was so heavily skewed in favor of a single individual who was either a foreign national or was controlled by foreign nationals, was never going to be a recipe for stability or for legitimacy in those countries. So for decades and decades, both Syria and Iraq were going through really nightmare situations. There was a period of time where in both of those countries, they were going through more than one new constitution or interim constitution every year, until ultimately what ended up happening is that a single, very, very undemocratic, dictatorial entity, the Ba'ath Party, seized power in both of those countries, ending all discussion about the constitution, about legitimacy, about plurality, about any of those things, and bringing an end to any type of democratic discussion at all, in the name of some form of stability, which eventually in both countries came crashing down. In Iraq first, the stability was never even there in the first place, but ultimately crashing down in 1991 and even further so in 2003. And Syria is the same. There's this fictitious type of stability, which was maintained for some people, but for many others was just a fiction, and then ultimately comes crashing down in 2011 as well, and lasting until today. So where does that leave us in terms of today, the future, where do we stand today, and so on and so forth? So today, Iraq is defined by what happened in 2003. The events in 2003 were themselves defined by the previous decades as well. So there what happens is you have another foreign invasion. So in this case, it's the United States with the United Kingdom who invade Iraq and decide that they're going to adopt another constitution. Now, that was another constitutional moment. You can't adopt constitutions whenever you want. You need to have sufficient momentum to do so. Typically, in most countries, it's very difficult to develop that type of momentum. In Iraq in 2003, that momentum did exist because a foreign invasion had taken place. Now, the United States and the United Kingdom, they went through a period of time where they tried to do things differently, but ultimately decided, we're going to organize an election, and the elected body is going to be responsible for taking care of the drafting process of this new constitution. That eventually didn't work out. So I don't want to go into the details of that in too much detail because it doesn't take too much time. And the more I talk about it, the more excitable I can get, and the more angry I get as well. So I'll sort of just talk about it in very broad terms. But if you want the full version, it's all in my book. Not everyone agrees with this, by the way, and other people have a different perspective. But I'm very confident that I'm right about this. Is that ultimately the process suffered from many problems. So first of all, of course, when the election took place, there was a boycott. So some segments of the population boycotted nominally Sunni Arabs. I don't think that matters as much as what I'm going to say later. That was obviously a problem to start with, but that wasn't the most important problem. The elected body is then composed. They decide we're going to create a constitutional drafting committee. So the elected body consisted of 275 members. They compose a body of 55 members, which is ultimately expanded in order to bring in people representing the boycotters. Theoretically, the Sunni Arabs were boycotted. So it's expanded to 70 members. They work for a few months during 2005. The constitution starts heading in a direction that's very much the dislike of the United States and their Kurdish allies. And then what happens is that in August 2005, the whole process is shut down. The constitutional drafting committee is told to go home, and only a few people are invited back into the drafting process or the negotiation process in order to finish the draft. And I use the word finish, and I use that only in terms of the notion of time. What they ended up doing at that point, when they shut down the Constitutional Drafting Committee and then started going at this invitation-only process that was very much controlled by the US Embassy, is that they went back to the interim constitution that was drafted in 2004 and which the United States controlled at the time, fully controlled at the time. So they took the draft that was produced by the Constitutional Drafting Committee, completely deleted for the most part the most important segments of that draft, namely the federal arrangements, and went back to what the Americans had drafted with a few of their allies back in 2004. And that became the template ultimately for what was adopted in the final constitution in October 2005, the referendum that took place in October 2005. So there we have a dilemma, right? Because the referendum was organized and the draft constitution was met with the approval of around about 80% of the population. So there are major problems that we have to deal with. So a text that receives 80% of the population's approval, I mean, that's a very, very high threshold. And for the most part, that sort of thing isn't met in the most democratic of societies. So what does that mean for the text of the Iraqi constitution in 2005? Can we say that it enjoys democratic legitimacy in that type of context, or popular legitimacy? My argument is no, that it can't, for different reasons. So one reason why is because the negotiators themselves represented a tiny segment of Iraq's political elite. And I say, and to be generous, I'll say that they represented 20% of Iraq's political elite. Why do I say that? Because the invitation-only negotiation sessions that took place were the only people who were allowed in the door and who were ultimately influential in terms of what was put in the final text were drawn from just a small number of parties. There were a few people who came in who were allowed in but weren't influential in terms of the discussions that took place. But ultimately, you're talking about 3, maybe 4 parties had a serious impact on the ultimate draft that was put to referendum. Everyone else was either excluded or boycotted. And amongst the parties that boycotted are, for example, the Sadrist movement. So many people may have heard that in Iraq at the time, that the constitution represented an agreement between the Shia community and the Kurdish community, and that the only outliers or holdouts were representatives of the Sunni community. So that couldn't be further from the truth. And that was a fiction right from the start. It was very, very obvious. Many people still believe it today. You know, in my view, they're totally mistaken, and you know they should come to terms with that. But I'm happy to discuss it if someone wants to raise it. So the reason why I say that is because, for example, the Sadrist movement did not participate at all in the drafting process. And as soon as the constitution entered into force, Muqtada Sadr did an interview with The Guardian, actually, in February 2006, where he referred to the constitution as illegitimate, right? And saying that it only represents American and foreign interests and so on and so forth. The other party that was very much opposed to the constitution was the Dawah party, which, you know, is not a very popular party nowadays, but was a dominant political force in Iraq from 2005 all the way until very, very recently. You know, so you have 2 of these very, very large political forces, dominant political forces in the country's largest community by far, which did not participate in any meaningful way in the drafting process. And then there are many, many others around the edges who also didn't participate. So, you know, that's already a major problem. The other problem with the voting process that took place in 2005 as well is that the referendum, the crushing majority of Iraqis, of course, didn't read the constitution. That's normal. That's not a reflection on Iraq or even the situation in which the Iraqis were voting, because obviously there was a lot of violence at the time. So people didn't really have a lot of capacity to sit down and read the text. They were mainly voting for things to just move on, right? So it was their vote of, let's just get this out of the way and move on to the next before the referendum took place. So people were voting on a text. Some of them may have seen a draft earlier when they were circulated in newspapers and so on and so forth, but no one really knew what was in it, apart from a few negotiators who were negotiating 2 or 3 days before the referendum took place. So that's, in my view, a real problem when it comes to popular legitimacy. So I don't accept at all that the text ever enjoyed popular legitimacy, and certainly has no claim to it today, given everything that happened. And then the other issue, of course, when I referred to it before about the 3 forms of legitimacy, popular, normative, and international, is normative legitimacy. So tragically, what the Iraqis decided to do is to do the stark opposite of what existed under Saddam Hussein and his criminal rule under the Ba'ath Party. So under that system of government, that was a hyper-presidential system of government, even more than what existed under the monarchy. Tragically, what the Iraqis did in 2005, those individuals who were responsible for putting the text together, is that they adopted a hyper-parliamentary system of government. And what do I mean by that? They did the direct opposite, which is to take a system where you had an unaccountable executive that controlled everything, than to have an unaccountable parliament that controlled everything, with no checks and balances on the parliament at all, no judiciary that can control any of their actions, no electoral system that they can't control as a parliament, no auditors who can control the actions of parliament. There's really no one who can get in the way of parliament and all of its constitutional prerogatives to control every single institution of state, regardless of how well it's functioning or how poorly it's functioning. And the ultimate outcome of that is that the parties that make up parliament, Iraq's parliament, are family-run enterprises, by and large. There's a couple of exceptions, perhaps. They're very undemocratic themselves. The way in which they conceive parliament is that it's a pie for them to carve up. And given that parliament controls everything in the state, including the judiciary, including everything else, then the whole state is for parliamentary groups to carve up from themselves, with nothing to get in their way, really nothing, not even elections. And the reason why I say that is because Parliament writes the electoral law. And there's no way that they're going to adopt an electoral law that's going to go against their own interests and that won't guarantee that they'll be re-elected. There are a few outliers around the edges. And from time to time, one of the parliamentary groups is cast out by the others, by agreement between the others. But there's a lot of solidarity between these parliamentary groups in terms of them standing together and sticking together to make sure that the system as it currently exists does not fall and continues and survives in the way that it does. So if you zoom forward to 2019, 14 years after the Constitution was adopted, and after all the horrors of pre-2003 and all the horrific things that happened then post-2003 and all the horrific things that happened then as well, you have a popular uprising that takes place in 2019. And what do the protesters demand? They demand a new electoral law. They say, not a new constitution, but a new electoral law. Now, why do they say that? Because in their view, to demand a new constitution would mean that the existing parliamentary forces would just negotiate a new pact between themselves once again. And in fact, that's what they tried to do. Despite the fact that the protesters were not demanding a new constitution at the time, the parliament composed a constitutional revision committee, the presidency composed a constitutional revision committee, and the council of ministers did so too. And the discussions between them all became, how can we take this existing text and tweak it to our advantage in one way or the other? Immediately, the parliamentary committee that was composed started discussing whether or not this is an opportunity to reopen some of the issues that them between themselves as parliamentary groups were not able to resolve for their own interests back in 2005. It wasn't at all what the protesters were asking for. What they were asking for was a new electoral law. And the reason why they were asking for that was because they were hoping that by virtue of a new electoral law, some of the political elites would be cast out, would not be returned in a new election. New political forces would emerge that would then allow for the negotiation of a new constitution more to the terms or more to the liking of the general population. So far, that's not what's on offer. And I don't see any prospects for that occurring today in Iraq. The protest movement simply does not have the leverage yet, and the members of Iraq's political elite don't feel any meaningful pressure on themselves coming from the streets. And in fact, for anyone who was in the circles of, in the political circles that control the country, who happened to be around at the time listening to the discussions that were happening between senior politicians in Iraq at the time, at no point would they ever have heard anyone seriously taking into consideration what the people wanted, what the people were demanding. And at no point did they ever consider there was any ever real danger against their control of the country. Now, if we take all of that and apply it to Syria today, so Syria has been through all sorts of horrific things as well. It's really, really, really sad. The question is whether or not today is an opportunity to bring stability and legitimacy to Syria after everything that's happened through the current constitutional process. And to cut a long story short, my view is that no, there is no opportunity to do so. And the reason why I say that is because the constitutional process, as it's currently composed, is not an opportunity to create a popular a constitution that enjoys popular legitimacy, or one that enjoys normative legitimacy, and for all sorts of different reasons. One reason why is because the negotiators themselves aren't in agreement that a new constitution is necessary, right? So you have a big component within the negotiators who are of the view that the current constitution is certainly fine, right? So certainly that's what the government component thinks. And many people in the opposition actually don't have any real problem with the constitution. Their problem is just that they're not themselves in control and they want to be in control. So given that they can't be in control, what they're proposing, at least insofar as I can understand, is to move more towards an Iraqi model, which would be really terrible for everyone. It may not make things worse than what it currently is in Syria, but it certainly wouldn't make anything better. And the other problem with negotiating a constitution in the current circumstances is that there's just no way in which this current text could enjoy anything resembling popular legitimacy, setting aside the fact that normatively there's just simply no hope. The dynamics just don't allow for the negotiation of a text that's going to create the sort of governance system that's going to serve the interests of the people. I just can't see that being a realistic outcome of this process. But on top of that, the popular legitimacy in the current circumstances after this horrific conflict, with so many people displaced, so many people forced to leave the country, almost none of whom are ever going to come back to their country, to refer to a text adopted in those circumstances as enjoying popular legitimacy, even if a referendum was organized, and even if the text was adopted by near totality of the population, in my view, would be ludicrous. I don't think that that's something that anyone should consider even arguing. So I'll end there. I apologize for being so negative about everything, but there's very little to be happy about currently in the countries that we inhabit. So I'll end there, and I'll be very interested to hear about people's thoughts, and if anyone wants to, violently contradict with anything that I've said, I welcome that, and I'm very happy to debate any of these issues. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zaid. That was very, very interesting overview of the processes in Iraq and in Syria. And I share you a lot of your views on the current process in Syria. Now, we have many questions, and the first two people who requested to speak, actually, their questions, are members of the current Constitutional Committee, right? The Syrian Constitutional Committee. They're actually part of the inner circle. Because, as you know, there is the 150, and there is this kind of like creme de la creme, 45 members, and they're part of the civil society, or what we call the middle third part of this small committee. So the first person who asked to speak is Omar Abdulaziz Hallaj. Omar, I accepted your request. Are you able to join us? Let's see. I'll turn my video off. Omar, are you with us? It may take a minute. I will give the floor while Omar connects. I'll give the floor to Mazen Gharibi. Mazen? Oh my God, no one is able to join. What's the problem? Let me see. Okay, Aziz is with us. Aziz? Can you hear us?
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, hi.
Sorry, yeah, my line got disconnected, so I, for some reason. Thank you, Zaid. Very interesting presentation that leads to a lot of reflections about what we're doing in the Syrian Constitutional Committee. The questions that come to mind is that most strikingly is that both in the formative years of Iraq and Syria, there were basically major rebellions at hand that were somewhat quashed directly by the British in 1919 all the way to 1923. And there was quite a bit of discontent still left in the country. And in Syria, as you mentioned, major parts of the country were under the government of Malik Faisal in Syria, and indeed there was quite a few rebellious elements on the fringes of that emerging state, and there was quite a bit of lack of definition of what is the state itself. Is it going to be an Arab state? Is it going to be a Syrian state? What is Syrian? There was not a definition of the country in that sense, and so to a certain extent, the conditions in which you're describing involved state formation. Today, we have actually a state that is cemented primarily through international pressure to keep the boundaries of the state, you know, the international normative framework, the UN convention that is still holding the state together. And in a way, the state is being held simply by external cement rather than by internal cement. So the point we have at hand here is even more difficult today because at least in the Syrian context, many Syrians don't see the necessity of actually sitting together at the table and dealing with each other. So the main problem is very often we project onto the external forces interventions into the internal affairs of our countries. But in reality, we as citizens of Syria or Iraq or other places have not done what is necessary to actually create a constituent force or a constituent assembly of sorts. So in a way, there's still a rejection of the idea of dealing with the opposing political forces on the ground. Each one of us is actually dreaming the others away rather than actually wanting to sit down and recreate the state from the inside out. So in that context, there has to be a starting point because in a way there is no external no internal cohesion, no internal cement for the state. And somehow you have to build that from the outside in. And that's what happened in the Syrian Constitutional Committee. The question for now is, naturally, the Constitutional Committee is not going to produce a constitution immediately. And what it may do actually is constitute the normative frameworks under which a state can be reconstructed. It may actually not be a constitutional text, but it could be something akin to a national dialogue of sorts, in which we reimagine the state collectively. That could be an option, and I know that the situation of a national dialogue can be sometimes very useful and sometimes absolutely, as it has been, a failure in other countries. But what would be the advantage of engaging in a constitutional negotiation that are not called constitutional, in the sense that they act more as the place where we reconstitute the imaginaire of the state, we reconstitute the need to live together, rather than constituting a legal text that will not be adhered to. We all know that it's not going to be adhered to, especially that there's no understanding that you need to have social forces behind a constitution for it to work. So in that sense, my concrete question is, what would be the value of this constitutional writing process as one step in ending the war and not as the step in ending the war?
Okay, thanks. Should I answer? Or
Yes, please do. Yeah.
Okay. So thanks very much for that, Amr. That was a really great question. So So the act of actually just drafting the constitution is a fairly minor step, I think. It's not the act of drafting the constitution that really matters. It's the act of negotiating a political vision for the country that's the difficult part. So if what you're describing is that the Constitutional Committee, that's been composed, these 150 individuals and yourselves as a smaller group, are going to negotiate a vision for the country, which, let's say, for example, it was, everyone agrees to it and they actually decide to follow through and implement it, that would be terrific, and that would be the bulk of the work. Then, as soon as the vision is established, then you can get, and if the vision was sufficiently detailed, doesn't need to be fully detailed, but sufficiently detailed, then you can get some experts around the edges who are members of political parties and that sort of thing, or who have a political background to fill in the details through a text, right? The lawyer's role in this case is very, very, very minor in comparison to the role that these very, very large, important, life-changing discussions and negotiations are supposed to have. But what I would just say that you touched upon something, and I think at one point I thought it was the core of what it was that you were saying, but now I'm not sure anymore. At one point you said we need to create a constituent force, right? So that I completely agree with. And there, what I would do is I would put a lot of people at fault, So I would put, of course, the regimes that destroyed so many people's lives at fault. I would put a lot of the opposition at fault. And I would also put a lot of the elites, even progressive elites, at fault there as well. The reason why I say that is because in these discussions about political pacts and about constitutions, which in my view are almost the same, right? What always gets left out is the individual, the people, right? And I don't mean the people as a community, as, like Sunnis and Shias and Druze and Christians or whatever, What I mean is the individual as a person and that individual's rights and what the state is supposed to, what type of relationship the state is supposed to have with that individual who's suffered so much and who's been through so many terrible things, right? There's almost no discussion about the relationship between the individual and the state, and just to reemphasize this, is that even progressives, when they get together and talk about constitutional reform, they don't talk about the role of the individual. They don't accept that the role of the individual requires any additional thinking. In their view, even progressives, not all progressives, but many progressives, in their view, the individual already has all the constitutional rights that they need, right? Whereas what's really missing in the conversation is to really carry out an in-depth look. And I would say this again, and I can't emphasize this enough in terms of the discussions that you're going to have or that you are having with your colleagues, is that it's terrific that, to talk about system of government and presidential versus parliamentary and decentralized versus central and federal and all the details that follow within that. But to have those discussions in isolation from a discussion about the relationship between the individual and the state, in my view, is missing the point, right? What could end up happening then is you may end up in a situation that looks like Iraq, right? Where you say, we'll have the most democratic system possible, which is a fully parliamentary system where the parliament controls everything, right? The elected representative of the people, they're going to control everything, right? But in the meantime, the individual as a person who requires assistance, who's suffered, who doesn't have the same privileges that I enjoy, for example, nothing is being done for those people, and the state hasn't been redefined for those people. So in all the things that you said, that was really the thing that struck at me the most. And what I would say is that in the national dialogue that you're having, it has to be more than a conversation between you as the regime and you as the opposition and us as, the civil society elites and so on and so forth. I'm not saying that that's what you're doing, and I suspect it's not what you're doing as an individual. But every time I speak to people around the region, that's how they conceive discussions about constitutional reform. They view it as a discussion between different groups of elites. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zaid. Thank you very much, Aziz. And now over to Mazen.
Thank you, Rim and Zaid, for this very interesting and insightful seminar. I'm really enjoying Zaid's observations and remarks about the the 2005 constitutional drafting process in Iraq. I have 3 questions actually. First 2 are specific to the 2005 constitutional experience in Iraq. You've mentioned that the consultation process outside of the drafting committee primarily took the form of invitations only, and these invitations were highly influenced or dictated by the Americans. Does that mean that there were no actual kind of any sort of community engagement in the drafting process? And specifically, what was the role of the secular-leaning Iraqi CSOs in the consultation process for the constitutional drafting? My second question is more specific to the issues of decentralization and federalism in the Iraqi constitution. According to your observations, Zaid, I'm very interested to hear your observation about how they actually how these discussions went in the constitutional drafting process, specifically between the Arabs and the Kurds. Again, when it comes to the issues of decentralization and local governance in the constitution. My third and final question, if you have time for this, is what are the main lessons learned, according to your experience, from the 2005 constitutional drafting in Iraq, in order to increase or enhance the popular legitimacy of any constitutional draft in the future in Syria or in any other Arab Spring country that are also kind of in the process of amending or writing new institutions, like Algeria, for instance. I would be very much interested to hear your inputs on this. And again, thank you so much for this very informative seminar.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for that, Mazen. Sorry, Rim. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, great. So those are 3 questions. I'll try to be brief, but I could speak about this for a very, very long time. So on the consultation process, and you mentioned community engagement. So there were formally, consultation processes out with the communities, and polling was done, and there were some meetings that were organized, like in various communities and so on and so forth. But first of all, that happened in a period of time where Iraq was increasingly unsafe. Day by day, there were more and more terrorist attacks and explosions and assassinations, so that didn't help, obviously. And the other thing is that the Iraqi negotiators never took those seriously at all. They were not interested in any shape or form what ordinary people thought. And as very clear evidence of that, the opinion polls, they went through this whole process. They established a public outreach committee. The Constitutional Committee established a public outreach committee, which I should just say for disclosure that at the time I was working for UNAMI, and I was part of a team that was called the Office of Constitutional Support. So, you can take that, if that impacts the way in which you're going to understand this, then please do that. Please do with it as you will. But anyway, so the Constitutional Committee established this public outreach committee, which was supported by UNAMI, by the Office of Constitutional Support, and the process of consulting the people and figuring out what it was that they wanted was controlled by a specific political party, which skewed the results and their outcome. They guaranteed that was going to happen by communicating, by consulting people as they were coming out of the mosque, for example, instead of asking them as they were coming out of the workplace. I'm sure they would have a very different opinion of things as they were coming out of a swelteringly hot, non-air-conditioned room. That would be a very, very different outcome to the polling process. And in any event, the results were revealed or were delivered to the Constitutional Committee after it had been dissolved, right? So the whole exercise was completely pointless because it was just arrived too late. And, in any event, the negotiators were never interested at all in the outcome of that. For them, it was really just a negotiation between them. And to be completely honest, also, that's usually the way in which these things happen. So even in the best of scenarios, in those countries where people consider the constitutional process to have been the most democratic, it's very, very unusual for the public outreach process to actually have any meaningful impact on the ultimate constitutional text. There can be terms that can be changed and so on and so forth, but the ultimate arrangements that are negotiated between the main political forces of the country, those are determined by the political forces, and they're not determined by what ordinary people want. That's the way in which things happen. Then you asked about the role of the secular leading group. They played a very minor role, sadly. They basically folded their arms. You can have a conversation about why that is, why they folded their arms, and why they didn't play a role. My opinion is that they weren't equipped for this. They just didn't know what to ask for and didn't really have any ideas of their own. Another view is that they were hoping that they would win in the elections that were going to take place after the Constitution entered into force, which they definitely did not do. They definitely did not win those elections. But in any event, they folded their arms and decided not to play a role, and that was a very sad indictment of their role at the time. Then your second question on decentralization, federalism, and how do those conversations go? So, I mean, that's really a conversation that's been happening over a period of decades. So, as you know, there's Kurdish opposition groups, who went through very, very difficult times with the Baathists, and even before the Baathists as well. And many of them were exiled. There were huge problems, and lots of massacres were carried out. They played a very big role in the exile community in discussing the future of Iraq. And then as they started engaging as well with other exile groups, there was a type of agreement. I don't know if agreement is the right word. It might have been an agreement. Maybe it's a bit softer than that. There was at least an understanding that in a post-war, post-Saddam Iraq, there would be some form of federalism. Either that the Kurdistan region would be recognized as a federal entity by itself as an exception, or that the whole country would be federalized. But that's like the historical background to it as to how it happened. Then when the constitutional process started in 2005, now this is where things get a little bit dicey, and some people don't like it when I say things this way, but I don't really care. In 2004, when the interim constitution was drafted, the federal arrangements were negotiated between the Americans and the Americans team and the Kurdish groups. The rest of Iraq's political elite did not really participate in those conversations. The details are all in Paul Bremer's book. It's not a very good book. I'm sure you'll agree with me if you've read it. But if you do read it, you'll see that all the details about how he personally negotiated the arrangements with the Kurdistan region with the assistance of his team, all that's there. There's also another book by Larry Diamond where they set that out as well, so on and so forth. So the interim constitution reflects the agreement between Americans and Kurds broadly. There's some exceptions around there, but I'm simplifying a little bit, but that's how it happened, in my view. Then what happens in 2005 is when the enlarged 70-member constitutional committee starts working. If you look at the history of the drafts that were published at the time, and if you can go to my website, you can download all of them free of charge. You'll see in the history of evolution of the drafts, as they start working, they start the template, the starting point is the interim constitution. And as they go along, the draft becomes increasingly centralized, right? So from June all the way to August, the central government gets more and more powers, the regions get less and less powers. Then the process is stopped altogether. The Americans do this invitation-only thing, and they decide on the federal arrangements, we're going to go back to where we were in 2004, and we're going to completely disregard what it was that the enlarged Constitutional Committee was negotiating earlier, right? That's my historical narrative, and that's the way I see things. And I have the drafts to back it up, and all the detail is in my book if you're interested. That's the way in which it evolved. Today, the conversation is still very tense, and sadly, because the 2005 Constitution doesn't represent a real agreement between the country's main political forces, between the communities, with the people, we're still negotiating these issues today. So they don't use the terms constitutional negotiations, but every year there's a problem about whether or not Kurdistan has the right to sell its oil internationally or not, whether or not transfers from Baghdad to Kurdistan, financial transfers, fiscal transfers have to happen automatically or can they be conditioned, how much solidarity there has to be between Baghdad and Kurdistan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are issues that we're still negotiating today that were definitely not resolved back in 2005. And that will take me to your third question, which is what's the main lesson learned to increase popular legitimacy? And there I'll try to be as brief and as simple as possible. So the first thing is that you can't fake inclusivity. You can't fake an inclusive agreement. In 2005, what we had was a fake inclusive agreement. It was a lie to say, and sadly many people believe the lie, to say that the agreement represented an agreement between 80% of the population's representatives. That is not right. And that's reflected by the way in which Arab groups throughout from 2015 all the way to 2020 refused to apply the federal arrangements. They refused to apply what's in the Constitution. The Constitution says things, and the Dawah Party, the Cedrist movement, Sunni Arab groups, secular groups, whatever it is that you want, they all refuse to apply those provisions. And the reason why they refuse to apply them is because they never agreed to them in the first place. The people who did agree to them did not represent them, right? So you cannot fake inclusivity. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that you cannot neglect the individual, right? The individual has a place, is part of the state, is part of society. The state is there to allow the individual to thrive, and the individual has been neglected. And the third thing that I will say, the third lesson, is that democratic constitutions cannot be negotiated by non-democratic forces. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaid. This is a great answer. Now, we have so many questions coming. Some of them are written, some are requested to speak. So we're going to take a question from Mu'tasim Siyufi and then go to the questions that have been typed in the chat box. Mu'tasim?
Thank you, Rim. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Zaid, for the very informative presentation. I have a very quick question. What are, in your opinion, the possible mechanisms to create checks and balance and oversight over the parliament and institutional design? Because as looking at the experiences of Tunisia, Lebanon, Iraq, other Arab countries, parliaments are going to be problems. And dysfunctioning in many cases, and instead of playing their roles to oversight the executive authority, they turn the parliament into a place where they can compete over their individual interests. So what are the possible constitutional mechanisms for to ensure such a relative checks and balance and oversight over the parliament? Especially that we know that in most democracies, parliaments are in charge of forming the judiciary authority. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Mu'tasim.
Okay, so in a country like Iraq, I would argue it's not possible, and the reason why is because it's too late. There are too many dynamics that are in play already. So we don't have a clean slate in Iraq, and it's we have to accept the reality that we're in. We have a parliament that's populated by non-democratic forces that are not interested in being controlled, right? I mean, so how do we establish in that type of circumstance checks and balances on their authority? They'll only do it if they feel compelled. And they don't feel compelled. So it's just, the chances that it's going to happen are extremely unlikely. In order to be able to do it, you have to have other factors that are at play, that aren't present in Iraq. So one of those would be, for example, pre-existing institutions, right? So pre-existing institutions that are exercising authority, that enjoy their own source of legitimacy. They may not be elected, but people broadly accept them, that have their own authority, so on and so forth. So, for example, in Egypt, traditionally, it's less so today, the judiciary is a powerful institution that enjoys some legitimacy and that has a lot of authority in the state. So today it's a lot less than it was in different points of Egypt's history. But that's the pre-existing nature of some of those institutions is a really important factor. And once again, in Iraq, that makes it, if you apply that to Iraq, that makes it even more difficult because a lot of those institutions were dissolved in Iraq in 2003. And those that weren't dissolved were extremely weak after decades and decades of war and dictatorship and massacres and sanctions and all those other horrible things that happened. And the other thing that the other factor that you need is at least some form of agreement by political forces that they're going to be bound. If they don't agree to be bound by checks and balances, by the courts and auditors and so on and so forth, then it's really it's a balancing act, and it depends on how strong they are and how much they can get away with. So we've been hearing a lot about, for example, in the States currently, in the U.S., about how Trump may refuse to accept the results of the elections and whether or not he can cast doubt on their legitimacy or their credibility and so on and so forth. It's a lot of people are worried. I'm personally less worried, but it's that type of discussion that you need to have in these countries, is that if your political elites are not democratic and are willing to go to extreme lengths to avoid being controlled, audited, to have courts examine their behavior, to be subject to democratic accountability, then you're in a lot of trouble, particularly if they're very powerful, particularly if they have weapons, like in Iraq, for example, particularly if they're very, very wealthy, like in Iraq too, right? I would say that in Iraq, the only way it could happen in a place like Iraq is if the political elites either feel compelled, and the only way in which that's going to happen is if they really feel that their lives are at stake, and so far we're nowhere near that, and or for them to be replaced. And so far that doesn't look like a realistic probability. Sorry for being so negative. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Zaid. I'm going to take some of the written questions. We have many, so I'm going to read two to you. There's a question from Muhammad Tawfiq Ali, and he's asking whether the COVID-19 pandemic will mark the end game for the Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon mass popular uprising. And he's asking, do you think the Iraq, Syria, and Yemen are fragile, failing, or failed states? That's one question. There's another question from Ghaith Muqawwas, who is going back to what you said about the exclusion of the Sunnis and Sadrists from the 2005 constitutional process. And he's saying, well, still 80% of the people voted for that constitution. So how did this constitution then have this high popularity despite the Sadrist and Sunnist disapproval?
Okay. So the first question was by who? I didn't get the name of the first person.
The first one by Muhammad Tawfiq Ali.
Muhammad Tawfiq. Okay, great. Okay, so for Muhammad's question, I don't think COVID-19 will have a major impact on the uprising. I mean, people, have really been through so much. I don't think the virus is going to be a disincentive for most people to go out and protest. What the problem for the protest movement in Iraq isn't the virus. It's just that they haven't achieved anything. It's the same in Lebanon. The protest movement, is in both countries. They started with a lot of energy and vigor, but particularly in Iraq, if you look at all the tragedies that happened, between 600 and 700 people were killed. Many people were assassinated, and so on and so forth. Nothing changed. So that really creates a disincentive for people to go out and protest. The fear of the virus may, around the edges, maybe some people may decide that the virus is too much of a risk and they don't want to participate in the protest. But I would say that's a small minority of people. I wouldn't say that many people would be really worried about that. It's mainly that people just ask themselves, well, what's the point? What can we achieve? And there it's popular anger will feed into that. So people know that historically protests in Iraq tend to happen either during summer or immediately after summer. And the reason why is because people tend to get very angry because of it's so hot in Iraq nowadays during summer, and the electricity network keeps on failing, and it tends to lead to a lot of excess deaths. Particularly old people. My uncle can't live in Iraq anymore during summer because it's too hot for him. That sort of thing. If people can get angry enough, then they may decide to go out and protest. But currently, there's just no momentum for it because people disfigure. We just haven't achieved much, right? And then the other question, Muhammad, was, is Iraq fragile or failed? I'm not sure how I would describe it. I don't really know. It probably falls under both of those categories. It's definitely failed for a lot of reasons. If you go out to many areas outside of the capital, you really don't feel that you're in a state at all. You just feel that, what is this? It's like some no man's land, some like Mad Max, type of scenario where, there's barely any building standing and people are really miserable and destitute and there's no authority, there's nothing, So those parts of the country definitely exist. And then on the other hand, you have Baghdad, which is very much under control, but is also really difficult to live. It's just like these horrible traffic jams of historic proportions and electricity and corruption and just, failing services everywhere, so on and so forth. I don't really know what the proper categorization of this state is, but it's definitely not functioning properly, or at least not for the population. It may be functioning fine for the political elite, but for the bulk of the population, their main ambition is either to change things altogether or just to leave. And then Raith's question, which is, how did 80% of the population vote for the referendum, vote for the constitution in the referendum? So I already discussed this a little bit earlier, so I won't repeat what I said earlier. But just to say that I'll add in another couple of elements. So the 20% of the population that didn't vote for the constitution was by and large the Sunni population, by and large. So if you look at the statistics that were circulated at the time, which I have and I'm happy to share afterwards if you want, it shows that the near totality of Anbar province and the near totality of Salahuddin province and a majority of Mosul and a majority of Diyala voted against the constitution, right? I think in Salahuddin it was 91% and Anbar might have been 98%, right? So let's set that aside. I don't think that's so important. What really is important, and the big question that one should ask is, how come 80% voted in favor if, for example, Muqtada Sadr wasn't in favor of the constitution? The reason why is because he remained silent. He decided not to get in the way of the constitution for different reasons, right? So one reason why was because there was this, political battle that was happening between the Americans and Sistani, Ayatollah Sistani, and the idea was that, okay, well, now the constitution is being drafted by these elected officials. But then when the American embassy moved in, it wasn't done in a very open way, right? And it's sort of done, behind closed doors. It wasn't very, very explicit. And so there wasn't a lot of outrage about it at the time. I was outraged, but a lot of other people weren't. And so people like Muqtada Sadr decided that they wouldn't say anything about it. They wouldn't get in the way. The Dawa party did take a position against, right? The Dawa party was very much, immediately, like during the drafting process, after the drafting process, and before the referendum, they very much said that they didn't like the constitution, right? And they've maintained that since then. But they also didn't ask for anyone to vote against. The overall idea was that outside of the Sunni community, everyone else, the idea was, let's move on, right? The constitution may be good, may be bad. We don't really know. We haven't looked at it, right? But broadly speaking, let's just vote and then move on. We'll have another election afterwards. And then when we have a better election after, foreign interference is lessened, after we have a text that some people have agreed to, then hopefully things will improve. Sadly, they deteriorated massively immediately after the referendum. So the referendum was in October, and then just 2 or 3 months later, violence quadrupled, sadly, right? So people didn't at all get what they were hoping for when they voted for the text. It was really, really a catastrophe by all measures. So, that's the best I can explain it. If you ask me why did people vote for it without reading it, I would think, my view is that people should read it, but realistically, people don't read constitutions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Zaid. We have a question from Nadia Ali. Her question concerns the complete disregard of the rule of law in Iraq today, understandably so, of course, due to decades of dictatorial regime, military occupation, and war. And then she's asking, is it possible to ensure the repeal of Bremer's constitution is accompanied by adherence to the rule of law in Iraq? I'll put to you another question from Gabriel Young, asking, are you pessimistic in regard to constitutional projects ongoing outside Syria and Iraq, for example, like in Chile in response to the popular uprising last year?
Okay. So on Nadia, and the second question was from Gabriel, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So on Nadia's question, is it possible to ensure adherence to the rule of law if Bremer's constitution is repealed and replaced by something else? I wish it was as mechanical as that. It's sadly, we have a political elite that isn't interested, right? So, you either have to replace them through, possibly through elections, probably either by forcing them to leave in some way, I don't really know, or you're going to have to live with them. And they control the country. They control government. They control the courts. They control parliament. They control, the finances of the state. They control everything, right? And they're not interested in the rule of law. If they wanted the rule of law, they could have established it. It would be relatively straightforward. There's all sorts of examples of how it can be done. There could be arguments about how best to do it, but there's obvious ways in which it can be improved in Iraq. But with the current people in charge, it's just it's a pipe dream. It's just not going to happen. So once again, I'm just coming back to the same issue, which is that we don't have a clean slate, and it's not a mechanical exercise. You have to either agree, or you have to do what other countries did, which is to organize a revolution, or hope for the best in elections. I don't know. And that brings me to the second question, which is by Gabriel. So it really just depends, So it's I don't know enough about Chile to talk about it, but I can talk about Sudan, for example, right? So Sudan's definitely imperfect, right? They have a lot of problems. Economics in Sudan is really terrible. Anyone who knows Sudan will know how really, really hard things are at the moment there. But politically, there's a revolution that's ongoing. They organized a revolution over a period of years. They implemented their plan, in a very structured way, not in the way that the Iraqis and the Lebanese did, of these grassroots, spontaneous demonstrations. The Sudanese created a structure, an organized structure, and they established a plan to carry out a revolution. They successfully implemented the plan, and now that organized force is involved in negotiating a peace agreement, which was signed the other day, and now also, getting ready to negotiate a constitution. So it doesn't mean that things are going to be perfect in Sudan. There are lots of negative forces there too, but I'm a lot more optimistic in that type of scenario where you have an organized democratic revolutionary force, which is in control, not under full control, but has partial control, and is influential on the ground, and is one of the negotiating parties, a very important negotiating party. When in that type of situation, I'm much more confident than I would be than, let's say, for example, if the Iraqi elites today announce that we're going to organize another constitutional revision process. I mean, I would probably participate if they asked me to in Iraq, but only because I'm Iraqi and I feel I should try, but I wouldn't be optimistic.
Thank you, Zaid. We have Zaki Mehshi here also with us. Zaki, the floor is yours for your question or comment.
Yes, thank you, Rim. Thank you very much, Zaid, for this very informative seminar. Actually, I have a quick question regarding the popular legitimacy and the authoritarian regimes. And here I'm talking mainly about the Syrian and Iraqi regime before the conflicts. To what extent do you think the authoritarian regimes in these two countries before the conflict did manage to gain popular legitimacy by providing public services, public employment, free education, free health, of course, by investing in political identity. And here I'm talking about the Arab-Israeli conflict and stuff like that. And accordingly, can we expect, or also can this current Syrian regime, assuming that the regime will get huge financial support, assuming that, can the current Syrian regime get or gain popular legitimacy by providing this kind of services, taking into account the lack of alternatives for Syrian people? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so thanks for that, Zaki. So I would say that, first of all, popular legitimacy isn't like a black or white scenario. It's not either you have it or you don't, right? So there are grades of popular legitimacy. So of course, someone who lives in Baghdad or in Damascus and has access to free healthcare, free education, a great university, right, might feel some positive feelings towards the state, possibly, right? They may even think that the state is fully legitimate. Some people would, and other people may be less inclined to have those feelings. However, and there are other parts of the world where we have small nation states like Qatar or whatever, which have tiny populations, right? And there are others are also in East Asia and in the Gulf and so on and so forth, where the GDP per capita is really massive, the highest in the world, and people are just like wildly happy because they're just really wealthy and have access to everything and so on and so forth, and don't really worry about democracy, et cetera, et cetera. So those sorts of situations like you have in these city-states can't be applied to Syria and Iraq because we have very large populations or relatively large populations. And the reason why that's important is because there isn't enough wealth in Iraq and Syria that can be derived through oil wealth to finance adequate services for everyone. It's never been the case, and it's definitely less the case today, right? And even in the golden era of Iraqi oil wealth, which was probably around about the 1970s, right? The population of Iraq was much lower than it is today. I think it was around about a quarter of what it is today. Even back then, you had these huge discrepancies between cities and the countryside. And even at that point, the delivery of services was partial. Some people had it and some people didn't. Many people were excluded because they were considered to be a lower class of people, because they were from the south, or because they were from the countryside, or because they weren't part of this tribe or that tribe, or because they didn't live in the capital and they lived in that city, or they were Kurds, that sort of thing, right? And other people were excluded for political reasons, because they were Islamists, because they were communists, and that sort of thing, right? So even at that time, the Iraqi state was very partial and discriminatory as to who could enjoy these services and who couldn't, right? And today, it's totally impossible to imagine, even if the Iraqi state decided that, you know what, we're going to deliver services to everyone, this current state would never be able to do so, even if they genuinely meant it. They would never be able to do so, because the disagreements between them as to economic policy, their incapacity to actually engage in economic reform, means that they're going to be wholly reliant on oil revenues. And there simply aren't enough oil revenues, even for a quarter of our current population. There's just no way that we can live off the oil revenues that we have today. In order to be able to do that, you would have to have a real democratic discussion in the country between democratic institutions that are going to establish a democratic economic policy that's going to take decisions based on democratic policy, meaning you're going to have, you know, a budget in a year, and you're going to have to decide your priorities, right? Are we going to invest in this or that, et cetera, in accordance with a plan that's determined according to political priorities. You can't achieve that when you have non-democratic forces in the parliament, where the parliament is completely controlled by non-democratic forces. And I would say, I'm not as familiar with Syria, but I would say that, I mean, you know, the likelihood that what you're describing is going to happen in Syria today is near impossible, even if, you know, the current elites in Damascus woke up tomorrow and had amnesia and suddenly decided that they were all going to just, you know, serve the people, right? In order to be able to achieve it, it would require a miracle. I'm just not sure how it could happen. If it did happen, they would still have to discriminate because there isn't enough money, and because there isn't democratic legitimacy in these countries, people would constantly challenge the state.
Great, thank you, Zaki. I'll put to you two more questions. We have a question from Ali Al-Mawlawi, who says that he's curious to know why stability is chosen as a benchmark for constitutional legitimacy rather than other aspirations such as liberty, social justice, and economic development. We also have a question from Hala Ali, who says in this webinar, Elizabeth Thompson, who is, by the way, with us here, and she just wrote a very nice comment thanking you for the presentation. So back to Hala, she says, Elizabeth Thompson stated that back in 1920s, the West feared the Arabic democracy. That's why they refused the Syrian secular constitution and won King Faisal over by crowning him in Iraq. Now, when you don't have the integral national authority and Syria is a place for competing international powers, how should we expect that the building of constitution agreed upon by people would be validated by authority and international powers present now in Syria?
I'm not sure I got the second question. Could you reformulate the question, please?
Okay, why don't you start with the first one and then I'll reformulate the other.
Okay. So as to
Hala is still with us. She can maybe just draft the second part of her question again. Hala, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So as to Ali's question, thanks for that, Ali. So yeah, I'm curious about it too. I can't remember how we came up with the title of the talk. I'll take responsibility for it. But I don't prioritize stability over liberty. You know, in my view, you know, this is my conception of what a constitution should achieve, and in these countries that we're talking about, in the countries that we're from, and the countries that we live in. In a country like Iraq and a country like Syria, in my view, what a state should try to achieve and what a constitution should contribute to is to allow for the individual to thrive, individual personal liberty to thrive. Why do I say that? Because for decades and decades, the individual has not been allowed to thrive. The only way that an individual could thrive over previous decades in Iraq and Syria and in other countries was by leaving, right? And that's just a tragedy beyond description. And so, in my view, that should be the whole purpose of what a state and state institutions should be designed to achieve. So, for example, if you were to look at, just to take a very practical example, to look at a judge, so judges are supposed to apply the law, right? But they're not robots, right? Judges are human beings. There's a lot of research that's been being carried out in very, very developed democracies, United States and other places, that show that judges are informed by their personal preferences, right? And there's a series of statistics that show in the United States, if you get a particular judge, your chances of being granted political asylum are close to 0. And if you get another judge, it's close to 100%, right? Just as an example. So judges in Iraq are equally that way. They're equally partial, right? They have their own personal preferences. What is my perception of what it is that they should be trying to achieve? Is it just a dry application of the law? You can't do that. You always have to be informed by your personal preferences, because there are always circumstances that need to be taken into consideration when you're examining a particular case. So what should be the priority? What should a judge lean on as their personal principle when deciding a case? In my view, a judge should be protecting liberty of the individual and should not be protecting the state from the individual, which is what's currently happening. Okay, so I completely agree with the question. I think that if you do achieve sufficient amount of liberty, then you do achieve stability. The problem with stability is that you can have stability without liberty. I'll just leave it at that, and I hope that's sufficient. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Zaid. We have a last question from Shireen Khalial. She asks, according to your knowledge of the new Syrian constitution, I think here she means the current one, the 2012 constitution, what are the pitfalls that you see in it? What are the steps that can be taken inside Syria to contribute to improving the Syrian constitution?
Okay, well, the big problem of Syria's constitution is that it adopts a hyper-presidential system of government, right? Where it places huge amounts of authority in the hands of the president. I mean, it's the same as what we had 100 years ago in Iraq. There's just no difference. The president can dissolve parliament at will, composes government at will, dissolves government at will, dismisses ministers, has full control over the Constitutional Court, appoints all the members of the Constitutional Court entirely on his own, right? I mean, these are authorities at this time, that democratic presidents only dream of, right? So it's not a pitfall in the sense that, a pitfall sort of suggests that you have a system that's in play, but there are problems that make it dysfunction, right? It functions exactly as it's supposed to function, which is to grant all the authorities to one person, right? That's what it's supposed to do, and that's what's happening, right? So some people may like it, I don't like it. And so if the question afterwards is what can be done to work against that, I'm not sure what can be done. If there's one thing that can be done inside Syria, is to try to increase awareness about, first of all, how that system of government ultimately does not benefit the general population, right? It's not in the general population's interest. It's also not in the state's interest either, because it ultimately leads to instability, even for the state that prizes stability, right? Which is exactly what we saw in Syria back in 2011 and 2012. If Syria was a democratic state, then all of these things wouldn't have happened to start out with. Possibly what I might argue is just to increase people's awareness, even officials, like senior officials of state in Syria, about how the system of government contributes to instability and contributes to danger, just for the individual, for society, for the state, for everyone. They may not agree, but that's the way how I see it.
Thank you very much, Zaid. I'm going to have a final question, especially as now we are coming to the end of our webinar today. You mentioned that most of the Iraqi people who voted for the constitution did not read it, and that is not surprising. But was there enough debate in the press about it? Did the elites try to highlight the controversial issues or the people that may concern people? And do people believe that constitution is relevant or is important? I think one of the issues we're having today when we talk about constitution in Syria, in the Syrian context, is many people, and particularly elites, particularly educated intellectuals, they say, but hey, constitution is irrelevant. Why is it important? Why are you talking about it? And I find this very surprising. As you rightly say, The Syrian constitution is highly, highly presidential, and it is functioning as it's supposed to be, which is like having all the powers under the hand of one person. So yeah, the constitution is an issue, and it is, one major reason why we have, the situation we're in today. Still, many people think it's not important, and they go back to some provisions in the constitution, in the Syrian constitutions, that actually grant people lots of rights, and they say, well, we have a text, but it's not being implemented. And the reality is, of course, is that the constitution itself is designed to make sure these rights will never be granted because of the way it's functioned, the dysfunctioning constitutional court, the fact that you can actually issue any law even if it contradicts the constitution. There are lots of issues with it, but that was one of the main issues we're facing now, is for people to believe that constitution is important. Did the people back then in Iraq believe that it was an important issue? Did they vote because they believed that it's important to change the constitution?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. So, the first question was there enough debate about the Constitution? So, there was some debate. There was, at the time there were a lot of media outlets that were developing very quickly, right? Many of which still exist today. So, there were discussions about it, and panels and press conferences and interviews, and some pamphlets and materials were prepared, by UNAMI, where I used to work, and others as well, to try to bring it some more, popular legitimacy, right? But the question is, whether or not that was enough. Ultimately, I don't think any of those things had any impact whatsoever. I just thought, I think all of that was just wasted. And the reason why I say that is because there wasn't a genuine agreement. There just wasn't a genuine agreement between the major political forces in the country, as illustrated by the fact that the main political forces outside of Baghdad, outside of Kurdistan, refused to apply the federal system of government as provided for in the Constitution, which means that there just was never an agreement as to those things. So you can have as many panel interviews as you want about the rights of the individual and, freedom of press and so on and so forth. The people who signed off on the text didn't represent enough people in the country, and also weren't really interested in those things. So, and I say this with a little bit of regret, and maybe this will be upsetting to people, but we may be reaching the end of this trend in constitution building. I don't know, maybe not, but there was a point in time, at least certainly like 5-10 years ago, when people really prioritized like public outreach and public participation in the drafting of a constitution. And I've got to say, I've never seen that work properly, ever. It's never worked properly. The idea that the people can participate in the drafting of a constitution, even in places like Tunisia, where I live today, where people talk about that a lot, right? They talk about, the public participation, and some academic papers were even drafted to prove that the people had a role in drafting the text. I mean, I don't believe that at all. I mean, and in my view, the historical record disproves that. There's a few words here and there that were put into the text of the Constitution in response to some of the consultations that were done, but not the important stuff, right? I mean, certainly the system of government wasn't determined because of, an opinion poll, let's put it that way, or because there was a consultation that was done, that sort of thing. So you have to just take those things into consideration. If the political elites themselves are not interested in what the population thinks, and first of all, and second of all, if all they're interested in achieving is carving out a part of the state for themselves to exploit personally for personal gain, and not in order to serve the rights of the individual, to bring about liberty, as Ali said, for example, if they're non-democratic, then it doesn't matter how much public consultation you do. I mean, it just doesn't make any difference, I would say. And I would even say it could even make things worse. And the reason why I say that is because it gives it a false veneer of democratic legitimacy.
Great. Thank you very much again, Zaid. That brings us to the end of our webinar. That was very, very interesting discussion. Thank you for everyone who contributed. There were amazing questions. And our upcoming events will be announced very soon, and they're going to be in Arabic. We have 2 upcoming events in Arabic. We are a bilingual program, so we are really looking forward to having, hosting Arabic events, and we have another event in the pipeline about Lebanon as well. So we'll be emailing you about all these events. Thank you very much again for being with us, and thank you, Zaid.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.